Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
On that day, Jesus went out of the house and sat down by the sea. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat down. And the whole crowd stood along the shore. And he spoke to them at length in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky ground, where it had little soil. It sprang up at once because the soil was not deep. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and it withered for lack of roots. Some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it. But some seed fell on rich soil and produced fruit, 100 or 60 or 30-fold. Whoever has ears ought to hear. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So we are in the book of Exodus, and last week we talked about the plagues of Egypt. We talked about how the plagues of Egypt were all directed against different Egyptian gods, right, that they worshiped. Right, so the message of the plagues was that God was going to battle for his people. He was going to rescue his firstborn son, Israel. We talked about that last week. So if you have your Bibles, you can open up to the book of Exodus again this week. Today we're going to be in chapter 14. We're actually going to be covering a number of chapters. So one of the parts of Exodus that sometimes gets overlooked is everybody knows about the burning bush. Everybody knows about the 10 plagues. People know about the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. But in between the plagues and the arrival of Mount Sinai, there was a lot of other things that happened. Like, real quick Bible trivia question, by the way. How many days did it take between the Passover night and the giving of the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai? Somebody know? How many days? 50 days. Okay, 50 days. So you guys have heard the word Pentecost, right? Raise your hand if you heard Pentecost, right? Okay. It's a Christian feast day celebrating the pouring out of the Holy Spirit on the apostles. But all the apostles were in Jerusalem for the feast of Pentecost. Pentecost celebrated the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, 50 days after the Passover. So in the Old Testament, the Jewish calendar, 50 days after Passover, you had the feast of Pentecost. It was one of the 3 major feasts where people had to come to Mount Sinai. So random Bible trivia question for you there. Pentecost it's Greek for 50 days. 50 days, okay? All right, anyway. So in between the 10 plagues and the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, a lot of things happened. We know about the story of the parting of the Red Sea, right? Moses with his rod, right? And he parted the waters. And then right after that happened, they sang this victorious song to God who was the victorious warrior. And then if you've read the book of Exodus, you know what happened right after they finished singing their song of victory, thanksgiving to God. You remember? The Israelites had just seen all these amazing miracles, the plagues, the waters being parted. And literally 3 verses after the song ends, the people started murmuring against Moses. They started murmuring against him. They said, "We're thirsty. When are we going to have something to drink?" And they went to the nearest body of water, and it was bitter water. And so they murmured against Moses. And Moses asked God for help, and God said, "Look at the tree over there, throw that into the water, and the water will become sweet." And that's what happened. They threw the tree into the water, and the water became sweet. And the early church fathers, they said this was like a foreshadowing of the waters of baptism that had been sweetened by the wood of the cross. So the waters became sweet. Later on, they started murmuring against Moses again because, again, they were thirsty as they were wandering. And so you might recall God told Moses to strike the rock, and from the rock water came forth. Later on it happened too. A few years later, Moses did this again, except for this time God was upset. We'll talk about that in a few weeks, about why that was the case. And then this is also when the people started murmuring against Moses about not having good food to eat. The people started murmuring against Moses in chapter 16, and they said, at least in Egypt we had good food to eat. We had meat, and we had leeks and vegetables. I don't know why they would complain about that, by the way. Leeks, I think, are pretty disgusting. But anyway, right, they were complaining about this as they were in the desert. Okay? And so God gave them manna. Remember, manna was like the bread substance that they found every morning. And then in the evening, what did God provide for them? Quail. So flesh. One of the things that we often forget about the miracle of the manna, it wasn't just a miracle of bread, it was a miracle of flesh. So every day, God gave his people bread to eat and also flesh to eat. Now, I know it's really hard for us to imagine God doing something like that for us every single day, right? A miraculous bread and a miraculous flesh, but just try, okay? You guys are supposed to be laughing. All right, Catholics, talk about the Eucharist, okay? We talk about Jesus being the new man and giving us his flesh to eat, right? It's just like what happened in the olden days with Moses. Now, what I think is particularly striking is two particular stories in the way that God spoke to the people. So the last miracle that God performed for them was in battle with the Amalekites. So just before they got to Mount Sinai, there was this group of people there called the Amalekites. The Amalekites were descendants of Esau. Remember Esau, the brother of Jacob? And back when we talked about the story of Jacob and Esau, we talked about how the descendants of Jacob and the descendants of Esau, they would be like enemies through the rest of salvation history. So the Amalekites were descendants of Esau. And the Amalekites were living in the promised land when the Israelites were wandering through the desert. So you can imagine what they were thinking. They had heard about the miracles in Egypt, and they knew that the Israelites were coming for their land. And what was going to happen when they got there? They're going to kick the Amalekites out. Because God told the people of Israel that it was their land. So the Amalekites, like many other peoples living in the promised land, they tried to think about how can we stop this from happening. And so the Amalekites actually went out and they did battle against Israel. And God told Moses, instead of being down where the battle was, he said, send Joshua, your great commander, send him to be in the front lines. But instead of you going down to battle, I want you to go to the top of the nearest hill. And what you are going to do is you're going to stand with your hands extended and your rod in your hand. And when your hands are extended, the Israelites will have the better part of the battle. But if your hands are lowered, then the Amalekites will have the upper hand in the battle. You guys might remember this actually comes up in the lectionary every couple of years. And so what Moses did, as the day went on, he started getting really tired, so there had to be two men who held his hands up. And they put rocks underneath his arms to make it easier. So you can imagine Moses was standing there the whole day as the people were fighting. Moses was standing on the top of the hill like this, with his hands extended in the sign of the cross. Again, the early church fathers, they saw this as a foreshadowing the power of Christ's cross. That the grace of God comes to us, and our victories over the devil, right, and our enemies, they come through the power of the cross, power of prayer. Really, really cool stuff. Now, but what I wanted to focus on is these two ideas about the battle of the Amalekites and also when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. Now, put yourself in the mindset of the Israelites as they were getting ready to cross the Red Sea. You know, if you ever get a chance to go to Egypt, you'd see the Red Sea, it's huge. When you're on the shore of the Red Sea, it looks like an ocean. It's this huge, massive body of water. And Moses parted it for the people. So you can imagine how amazing that must have looked. How tall those walls of water must have been. It's like the ocean parted, except for just a sea. And when the Israelites were encamped there, they had been liberated from Egypt. And lo and behold, Pharaoh changed his mind. And so Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, from the most powerful nation the world had ever seen in those times. He was angry and he was coming for the Israelites. And he brought his entire army with him. And you can imagine what the Israelites were thinking. We've done it now. His son is dead. What's going to happen, guys? And again, they started murmuring against Moses. Now this is what is so beautiful. I want to read this verse. What Moses told the people. If you have your Bible with you, open up to chapter 14, starting in verse 13. As the Egyptians were approaching, this is what Moses said to the people. He said, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again, and the Lord will fight for you. And you have only to be still." The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be still. Powerful words, right? You know, what are the things in your life that you are fighting for? Many of us, when we go through life, we feel like sometimes life is just like a battle. For some of you, maybe it's your children, especially as your children, when they're younger, it's like a battle to take them to Mass, right? See if they'll make it to the Mass. When they get older, they start saying things like, I don't believe in that stuff anymore. I don't believe in God. You feel like you're battling with them just to get them to come to church. Maybe in your job, maybe your boss is really hard on you, or maybe there's some coworker that just seems to have it out for you. Maybe in school, like maybe there's this one person in your grade or in your class who just is always trying to get on your case. Maybe it's a family member. Oftentimes, many people will tell me that when they go to family gatherings, right, it's anything but relaxing. It's stressful because there's various disagreements or grudges in the family. What's the battle in your life right now? Listen to these words from Moses. Stand firm. The Lord will fight for you. You have only to be still. When I was in seminary, at a certain point, so I was in seminary for 9 years, which was a really long time. And one of the seminaries I was at, it was kind of a struggle for me. And I didn't really get along very well with the formators. I had a lot of disagreements about how the seminary was run and things like that. And it seemed like every day it was like I was just hitting this wall. Like any time that I would try to do something good, it seemed like it always fall short or something would go wrong. And I just felt like I was battling every day in seminary. And then lo and behold, after I'd been there for a couple of years, I took a year off from the seminary. Some would say that I got kicked out. I affectionately say that I got held back a year. That's why I was in seminary such a long time. Okay? So I was pretty stubborn. And when I was gone for that year, I kept asking God, God, why is this going on? Why is this happening? Why is it just like roadblock after roadblock? And I felt like throughout that year, what God was telling me was exactly what Moses told the people. Stand firm, but the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Why are you trying so hard to force these things to happen? You need to let God be the one who leads, the one who fights for you. And I'm sure many of you probably can't relate to that story at all because none of you are as stubborn as I am, right? And have those battles to deal with in your life. But sometimes we can get in that way, right? We try so hard to do the right thing or to change people's minds. And yet the Lord is telling us, just stand firm. Let me fight for you. One of my favorite people to learn from on the internet, he's actually he's technically a political commentator, but I wouldn't really call him a political commentator. He's more like a cultural commentator. His name is Michael Knowles. Some of you might be familiar with him. He's a very devout Catholic, and one of the reasons why I really admire Michael Knowles is because he is a very devout Catholic. And he recognizes that his opinions about culture and politics are very much a minority view in our culture today. And what amazes me about when I listen to him or when I watch him speak is that contrary to so many different people, when people disagree with him or people are like hateful towards him, he doesn't respond in the same way. He doesn't get flustered. He doesn't get upset. He doesn't get angry. He simply stands his ground and lets the Lord do the rest of the work. He doesn't feel the obligation to like change everybody's mind immediately. He just simply stands firm. This is what I think. This is what I believe. He doesn't feel the pressure that you might sense with so many different people. Like sometimes with us, right? If you're talking to somebody who's like disagreeing with you or debating with you, sometimes it's really easy to lose your cool, right? And get heated. But that's because we're trying too hard. So maybe you have some free time. You can listen to Michael Knowles, right? You might not agree with everything that he says, but it just is the way that he approaches trying to change people's minds. And he isn't worried about Catholic. Oftentimes people aren't asking him about politics, they're actually asking him about God and religion. And it's just amazing how he just stands firm, stands his ground. But there's no sort of anxiety that you sense. I think that's something that all of us can learn from. Because all of us have those battles that we're trying to fight. Like maybe your baby is crying right in the middle of this amazing homily, right? Gosh, it's just so distracting, you know? You just want to hear everything that the priest is saying. Right?